Can I have your attention?
Educating the entire student body on race, gender, class, sexuality.
There's no objective journalism.
No one has to perform poverty at all.
Not all students matter in this university, and that is a fact. It's supposed to be about robust political debate.
This is OppiFM.
Mawene, and good day to you all. Welcome to the OppiFM podcast. My name is Julia Fish, and I will be your host today. In today's broadcast, we look at the contentious proposed name change for the city of Grahamstown. The name of the city, due to historical and iconographical issues, has been proposed to change from Grahamstown to Makhanda. The process, spearheaded by the Provincial Department of Arts and Culture, and as we will point out several times during today's broadcast, the date to make objections or recommendations on the name change is fast approaching. Residents and interested parties have until June 6th. To discuss the issue and some of the technicalities around objecting, I'm joined in studio today by a member of the local lobby group, the KGG, or the Keep Grahamstown Grahamstown Committee. Welcome to Advocate Jock McConnachie, who is a founding member of the KGG and former local political party leader. We're pleased to welcome you.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Before we begin, OppiFM took to the streets to find out how people felt about the proposed change.
I think it's definitely a process that needs to be looked at because it's necessary for us as a black nation in Africa to take back our history.
It's like white history is being erased.
If it's changed to something like valuable and something that really does encompass everyone, sure thing.
If the name were to change, I don't think people would recognize it being Grahamstown because everyone knows it as Grahamstown.
If the name changes, then the place will have a better historical background and future.
I can't imagine telling my friends that I'm going to Makhanda.
If Makhanda represents the people who live in Grahamstown better, then it will be more beneficial for it to change its name.
Now, Jock, as a member of the KGG and founding member, actually, can you tell us a little bit about what your organisation does?
All right. KGG was formed back in 2007. The then mayor, we've had a succession, so Mayor Carty, I think was his name, announced that the name of Grahamstown was offensive and must go. I then decided, because I'd been sounding people out on this, the subject of Grahamstown's name for some time, and focusing on Grahamstonians of many years standing, much longer than myself, and mostly and many of whom were black Grahamstonians, found that, in fact, in my experience, the name was not found to be offensive. I then put Mayor Carty's statement to the test by running a snap poll, but a very balanced one of different parts of town, predominantly residents of the township areas of Grahamstown. I hate packaging us up into these parcels, but it's the way it seems to be. And the results of that survey showed that, in fact, the statement was not borne out by the opinions of people on the Grahamstonians on the street.
Sorry, Jock, how many people were actually involved in that survey, like number-wise? Proportional
people
to the
who were taking the questionnaire.
Yeah, so proportionate to the
there
actual
were about
population of the town.
5 points around town, 5 different points on a busy Saturday morning, month-end Saturday morning. I'm going back now to 2007. And the results, on the strength of that poll survey, which wasn't a scientific one, but we tried to be as balanced as possible, launched KGG. And we said we wanted to make a positive contribution. We recognized it was necessary to have the debate, and we wanted to make a positive contribution to the process.
So you mentioned that, of course, in 2007 this process started. There have been several dismissed chances to try and change the name. Why were those not successful and this going forward?
All right. Okay, I'm not quite sure what you mean by dismissed, but yes, we had 3 full processes. You've interviewed Councillor Wells, Julie Wells, Professor Wells, and I'll be interested to hear what Julie says. Julie was the chairperson of the naming task team of the municipality. They were very full processes, give them their due, which is how it's supposed to be done. Ward meetings in all the different wards, etc. I've always said that this whole thing was about delivering on a predetermined outcome. The name, there was a decision made by East Cape Names, Geographic Names Committee, that the name will change. The mayor's own statement reflected that. And they've made many other statements of a similar vein. And they didn't get the outcome they wanted. Instead, there was supposed to be a deadline. Submissions had to be submitted. They were submitted. It was then supposed to be put to council for a decision. That never happened. They merely allowed the matter to lapse. And then only to bring it up again on subsequent occasions. And we've been through 3 of those full processes, none of which produced the result they wanted. Now East Cape Names have taken the matter into their own hands and said, you're not giving us what we wanted, and we're going to fast track this process to make sure we get the predetermined result we want.
Now, you said you're quite interested to hear what Julie Wells had to say, so
Yes.
let's jump straight to that. For many, the name Makhanda doesn't necessarily mean much. Most people assume that the second name of the city is Ekhini. So Refilwe Mofokeng sat down with retired professor of history, head of the Isikhumbuzo Applied History Research Unit at Rhodes, 3-term local ANC councillor and chairperson of the Makhanda Municipality Naming Task Team, incredibly all one person, Professor Julie Wells, and spoke about the significance of the proposed and current name and what the costs of the exercise would be.
Often surprised at the people who really don't want to see the name changing, that I find they seem very unwilling to apply their minds to what does the name Graham stand for. And yeah, they usually make the argument, oh, well, we're just used to Grahamstown, we like Grahamstown, it sounds fine to us, but part of the legislation says that names should be changed if they're found to be offensive to people. The name of Colonel John Graham for South Africans really should be one of the most offensive names there is, and that's what a lot of people say, because he was the British military commander who cleared this whole region of all indigenous people in 1812, using scorched earth tactics, just shooting people on sight, doing everything just to take over the land, much as Israel did in Palestine. Just to say, I want that land, everybody get out, and forcing them out, at gunpoint. It really was probably the harshest, most bitter land seizure in South Africa. And then they named the town after him. So to me, to live in a place called Grahamstown is like being in Israel and living in Hitlerville. Why would anybody in Israel choose the name Hitler? It just doesn't make any sense. So I really would invite people who might feel a bit comfortable with the name Graham to actually think what it really stands for. It seems quite clear that the most popular proposed name is Makhanda. And that's because of the role played by the historic figure Makhanda, who led an attack on the British military headquarters in Grahamstown in 1819. I think it would be honest to say that he is just considered a hero of African wars for independence and self-sufficiency and so on. So they feel that name is the most exciting name for the town. The name Ekhini has often been associated with Grahamstown. It was used during the apartheid era for Grahamstown East. Look, as soon as this democratic government came into office, it passed policies and legislation on name changes. It set up something called the Geographical Names Committee. And it's got structures at different levels. There's national and provincial and district committees. That was in recognition that all of the names that we inherited in South Africa are reflecting the cultural, political, and economic biases of the colonizers. Part of that legislation says if anybody writes into one of these statutory geographical name bodies and says, I would like you to consider that name because, and they have to give a reason. So what's really bringing it up at this point in time is that regardless of any previous debates, is people are still writing to the provincial Geographical Names Committee saying we object to the name of Grahamstown and we propose a change of name. And so they are now obliged to come and to test public opinion and decide if a name change is justified. Now it's the province has come back to lead the the whole process. Partly because the oppositional movement said at every turn, everything you do, we're going to sue you. And by that time, municipality was having its other issues, and we didn't need any extra lawsuits.
The process of a name changing is quite expensive. So let's talk about the cost aspect of this. Is the funds in play?
I'm very tempted to say, what do you perceive as the expenses that are involved? And are you thinking of expenses of the consultation process itself, or expenses of literally coming with a change? Those who object to changing the name try to raise the costs, and certainly locally this is what they were doing. They would go to people and say, do you want a new house or a name change? In terms of the way government works, is that not a cent would be taken away from housing to do name changing, because everything is budgeted in certain votes, certain categories, and if you've allocated 50 million for housing in Grahamstown, that 50 million can only be spent on housing. So, as I said, from our analysis, the costs actually get spread very thinly. Much of it is just integrated into business as usual by the responsible parties. So, it's nothing that's going to be a big, huge shock impact. And if anything, when we were doing our research, we found sometimes where your name change actually begins to send a more positive kind of signal that people respond to. Nobody quite said it, but I think perhaps it was Polokwane that when they changed from Petersburg to Polokwane, they said, no, then somehow lots of economic development came to Polokwane because that name seemed to be more appealing to people.
So, Jock, there are some pretty hard-hitting allegations there. First off, usually name changes are overturned later due to lack of consultation. Has the process here been inclusive?
The three processes run by the Makhanda municipality in conjunction with East Cape Geographic Names Committee were inclusive and were thorough. Didn't give them the result they wanted. The whole argument does turn on the question of whether the name is felt to be offensive by the local residents. And let me say that we as KGG are on record as saying, and it's still our position, that if indeed the residents of Grahamstown and further afield feel that the name is offensive, I as a staunch Grahamstonian wouldn't want to live in a place where I knew that the majority of the residents of the place find the name offensive on a daily basis. If that was the case, then the name should be changed. We are on record as saying that. Julie, you say hard-hitting views, nothing we haven't heard before. I don't believe it's particularly hard-hitting. She presents a biased view, her personal bias, which I find disappointing coming from a historian, because I'm not a professor of history, but I majored in history at this very institution. We were taught a very balanced view of history. We were taught not only the good side of the colonial history, we were taught actually the focus was more on the bad side. And I recognize that, and we as KGG recognize the bad side of it. But one thing we were taught, never judge historical characters or events outside of their context. And I've taken that one up with Julie on numerous occasions, in public fora as well. And she's never come back with an answer on that score. She harks back 200 years to, more than 200 years now, to John Graham and what a bad man he was. We've, as KGG, once again, we've never based our argument on trying to defend the reputation of Graham, and we're not about to start doing that. But to liken her to him to Hitler is really taking things a little bit far. He didn't exterminate a whole population as Hitler did with the Jews. There were no gas camps, there were gas chambers or anything like that. In fact, Julie's a little bit economical on the historical side. Graham was in the area for 3 months in 2012. He was the head of the army, so he has to take responsible for it at the time. He was acting on the instructions of Colonel, then Governor Craddock. Soldiers do what soldiers have to do. That's not to say that what he did was right, and I'm not saying it. But, I'm not defending Graham. There are other arguments, which is also not a cost argument. She raises the question of costs. We as KGG have never said personally. It's an argument which many people have raised that cost is the biggest thing to be considered. Once again, coming back to the offensiveness. If people experience it as offensive, then yes, it should go, and yes, it's going to cost money, but so be it.
At one point, Professor Wells actually throws down a challenge for the people who oppose the process to actually produce a budget. Like, if this is a big issue, give us rands and cents values.
That has actually been done. So, Julie, that has actually been done, and it was done. I'm no economist, and as I've said, we don't base argument on the cost thing anyway. But that has been done, and it does come to a substantial amount of money. But if the name's offensive, then so be it.
So you as the KGG don't necessarily oppose the name Makhanda, you just want to keep it Grahamstown?
Okay, we don't. No, we don't. If Makhanda is if it's offensive, the name and shown to be offensive, and it's the outcome of the process, which must be a fair and a thorough process, is that the name is experienced to be offensive and must go, and the majority of people like Makhanda, that's fine. I have no problem with the name Makhanda, which is the same name as the municipality Makhana, except that they misspelt the name Makhana, which is rather ironic. But Julie, once again, shows a rather narrow view of history. I'm sorry, Julie, Professor of History. Igini long predates apartheid. That was just a very small chapter, and long predates apartheid. And there was a letter in last week's Grocots by a doctor, I forget the name now, local, who said that if we have to have another name, it's Igini for me, and it will remain Igini. It's been around forever. Put petrol in Cape Town, and in the days when we used to have our own registration number, or you just mention the name Grahamstown, any Xhosa speaker will say to you, Igini. And we have, as KGG, pushed for rather parallel names, Grahamstown, Igini.
Much like they have with Tshwane and Pretoria.
Yes, but although that Pretoria applies to a very small section of Pretoria, parallel names applying to the whole place, and there are international precedents for it, but our names commission is dead set against parallel names.
You're listening to OppiFM.
Political analyst, broadcaster, and author Eusebius Makaiser was in Grahamstown to deliver the DTS Oosthuizen Memorial Lecture on Academic Freedom recently. Makaiser grew up here in Grahamstown, attended Graham College, just down the road, and is a prominent Rhodes University alumni, just like yourself, Jock. I caught up with him after his talk to get his opinion on the name change, and like most of us, he seems relatively torn.
And an alumnus of Rhodes University, I have felt conflicted about the name change debate, mostly because I'm known as an opinionated man, and on this issue I do not yet have a settled view. I do think, however, that the name change helps us to reimagine what Grahamstown can be. Grahamstown is a complicated space. It's deeply unequal. It's a city that most of the residents do not have a stake in terms of opportunities for flourishing. And a name change is not the same thing as material change. But a name change does present opportunities. And I think one of the opportunities is to try and reimagine the city.
One of the main contributors to this town and its main economic aid is Rhodes University. If the town changes its name and the university doesn't, what does that say?
I think there will be increasing pressure on the university to expedite the process for debating whether Rhodes University should formally change its name, given that the city is really taking the cue and role modeling the importance of naming. And I think the biggest mistake we can make, and we're allowed to agree and disagree about whether we should change the name Rhodes University and what it should become if we do change it, but the biggest mistake we can make is to be frivolous about what it means to think through iconoclastic imagery in our society. When it comes to statues, when it comes to names, there's a tendency by those who want the status quo to remain to think that activists are being completely frivolous and not properly prioritizing questions around the material conditions that we live in, including in this city and this university. I think that's a mistake. I haven't made up my mind whether Rhodes University should change its name or what it should change its name to. But what I am deeply committed to is taking seriously the sense of injustice experientially that opponents to the name feel in this particular space. And I think that's an important starting point for meaningful dialogue.
And as part of alumni networks, I know of a story, for instance, in Johannesburg, Dr. Mavazela was invited to a golf day as part of an alumni funding event, and he was told in no unclear terms, you will listen to us, not your first years. As part of those networks, what are the conversations happening perhaps in those spaces that aren't necessarily happening on the ground here in the university and in the town?
Yeah, the question about the attitudes of most alumni is a very important one. And the truth of the matter is that most alumni are conservative by nature. When we get older, we become less attentive to injustices in our society. We live in the suburbs, and we have more romantic, nostalgic ideas about how hotter the summers were when we were children. So I think there are two important points here. The first point is that it is in the nature of older people to be more conservative. That means that we cannot give undue credence to the weight of the alumni opinion. The second viewpoint is that we need to have a better debate amongst ourselves as alumni, and maybe it's time to start it, and this is a very good question to provoke my own, I think, apathy in that regard. Alumni must just bloody well sit down. We don't own the university as alumni. A new generation of Rhodes students are entitled to experience the Rhodes that we didn't experience and to come up with forms of activism that we never imagined.
One last point, you spoke about the material conditions that need to change. In changing those material conditions, do we not have to look at the cost of what something like this will take? Because that's usually the counter-argument that people go, well, if you want the money to change social injustice, we can't be spending it on something symbolic.
Well, I'm sure this praise might not make the final cut, but it endears me that you left the cost question for last, and that I also didn't take the opportunity to foreground it in our conversation so far. And the reason is that I think the cost argument is, in many ways, a refusal to engage what it means to have the same existing names, imagery, statues, and symbols in society. And it's not a genuine dichotomy to choose between the material development of society and thinking about who it is that we honor. Let me take the gauntlet. In a hard case where we genuinely have to make a choice between getting a few more people from my colored community in Grahamstown or Xhosa into Rhodes versus the cost of changing the name, I probably would end up voting for greater access to people who are currently excluded. But for me, that should be the last item on a discussion agenda if we had to arrive at the university for a special assembly debating the name change. And the people who want the cost argument and issue to be the first item on the agenda, and I'm not saying they won't win the argument, but the people who always prioritize that as the most important factor are the ones I'm most suspicious of, because they are refusing to understand the kind of pain that's being articulated by those for whom name changes are not frivolous.
So the issue is definitely one of nostalgia, recognition, familiarity, but it kind of goes beyond that. Several other institutions in this town, such as the National Arts Festival, Rhodes University, the Grahamstown Foundation, are all kind of affected by this as well. So are these larger institutions like the National Arts Festival involved with the KGG? Are they also going to have their say on June 6th?
No, they're not. And whether they will or won't, I can't tell you, except that what I do know in our experience is that most of these organizations, and it applies also to our present Grahamstown Residents Association, the Grahamstown Business Forum, they're all kind of keeping their heads down on the issue. The Grahamstown Residents Association has made a submission, rather a wishy-washy one, but at least they've taken a position. Mostly on process, which I'm also happy with, but no, none of them have certainly been involved with the KGG. Yeah.
So before we end off, let's just recap the objection process and what people should do if they want to oppose the name change.
Okay, but there's one thing I have to say, and I've said what the KGG's arguments aren't, that we're not historical, don't base it on a cost objections. But our argument is that it's important to keep the name Grahamstown for reconciliation purposes, which is, and I can see you looking surprised, Julia.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting perspective.
Yeah, well, it is the mainstay of our argument that Makhanda or Makhanda, which should be the name of the municipality, the correct spelling.
That's something we need to address as well.
Plus Grahamstown equals reconciliation. In our preamble of our constitution says South Africa belongs to all, and reconciliation is right up there as one of the main things that we should be about achieving. And having the name Grahamstown within the greater municipality of Makhanda, tells you how far we've come down history. We've put past conflicts behind us. And that is what reconciliation is. It's bringing opposites together. And the two names together tell the story of where we've come from and where we are. Our other argument is that, and it's one repeated often by people in their own personal capacities, and it's a view which is, I've seen many of the comments, objections that have gone now as part of this new current process, which hasn't been a process, I'm putting in inverted commas, saying this very thing, that people don't associate the name Grahamstown with Colonel John Graham. It's digging up old bones. It's opening old wounds, reopening old wounds. It's anti-reconciliation, in fact. And even somebody as Archbishop Desmond Tutu called it a red herring of the worst kind to deflect attention away from more important issues. So, yeah, but the process, as I said, I was very happy with the municipality's own processes, which never got the predetermined result they wanted. The current process is not a process. It was one meeting held in a single venue, attended by fewer than 100 people. That's not a process. And it doesn't meet the guidelines or the legislative requirements, and it falls far short of the threshold laid down by the Supreme Court of Appeal in the case of the Louis Trichardt Mercado affair, where the name change got reversed 7 years after it had happened. We are, if the East Cape names people carry on as they're doing now, that is going to be the inevitable outcome. It'll be reversed. The Minister of Arts and Culture is not going to want to have the same embarrassment. And personally, I think that it's an exercise in futility.
So if anyone wants to have a look at what the KGG's objections are, you have a website?
Yes, we do, yeah.
And there's a lot of information there on what your submission is for June 6th and how people can go about that process.
Yes, the whole background, and I think it's very balanced. We also deal with the Graham issue. Julie says people close their eyes to it. We don't close our eyes to it. We give the whole historical background and brought up, and it's since 2007, right up to currently.
So what is that website address?
www.keepgrahamstown.co.za. Keep Grahamstown, one word.
We've come to the end of our show, and thank you very much to our guests for joining us and giving us this vital information. We urge all of our listeners to please participate in this process, as well as the local elections, which also have a bearing on this process too. If you have any views or opinions on the show, please contact us on the Oppidum Press Facebook or Twitter pages. I would also like to thank my entire OppiFM team for their dedicated work, especially my producer, Paige Muller. And lastly, from myself, Julia Fish, it's been great, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Can I have your attention?
Educating the entire student body on race, gender, class, sexuality.
There's no objective journalism.
No one has to perform poverty at all.
Not all students matter in this university, and that is a fact. It's supposed to be about robust political debate.
This is OppiFM.